Have you ever, like, just completely zoned out for a sec? You know, you're just staring at something like, I don't know, the microwave, waiting for your popcorn, and then suddenly, bam, you realize you've been totally lost in thought.
Yeah, we've all been there.
But what even is that, right? Not the popcorn craving, but the thinking part. I mean, it's like this constant hum in the background of our minds, even when we're not actively trying to, like, solve a crossword puzzle or remember where we put our keys. It's a pretty bizarre thing when you stop and really think about it, no pun intended.
It really is. And the more you try to pin it down, the more slippery it gets. It's one of those things that's so fundamental to our experience, but so hard to actually define.
Right, it's like trying to grab smoke, and you can get lost in all these, like, philosophical debates and brain science stuff that honestly makes my head spin. But don't worry, because we've been doing some thinking about thinking for you. We dove into this really interesting book called Beyond Artificial Intelligence: From Human Consciousness to Artificial Consciousness by Elaine Cardin. And it goes deep, like really deep into this whole business of how our minds work and how we get that feeling of actually thinking.
And the book calls it our psychic system, which I thought was kind of a cool term.
Yeah, it sounds way more like mysterious and sci-fi than just brain, right?
Definitely.
Anyway, Carton's work takes a really unique approach. It's not so much about the specific things we think about, like whether pineapple belongs on pizza, but more about the underlying structure of our minds that makes all that thinking even possible.
Exactly. It's about understanding the foundation upon which our thoughts and even that feeling of thinking arise.
So, our mission, should we choose to accept it, and we totally are, by the way, is to dig through this book beyond artificial intelligence and pull out some of the most mind blowing and maybe even useful nuggets about how our brains are wired to produce this nonstop stream of thoughts and that weird feeling of like, hey, I'm the one in here doing all this thinking. So buckle up, listeners, because things are about to get pretty meta.
It's a wild ride for sure.
Okay, so the first thing that really struck me in the book was this idea that thinking isn't like some kind of like finished product. It's not like, building a Lego set and then you're done. It's way more dynamic than that.
Right. It's a process, not a state. It's like constantly in motion, always changing, always evolving.
Yeah, it's more like those lava lamps, the ones with the blobs that are always like morphing and swirling around. Our thoughts are kind of like that, always forming and reforming, never staying the same.
That's a great analogy. And the source really emphasizes that thought is fundamentally dynamic. It's not a fixed state, but a continuous flow of energy and information. And this flow is happening across different parts of our brains simultaneously.
So it's not like there's one little part of our brain that's labeled thinking department and everything happens there. It's way more distributed and interconnected.
Exactly. It's this amazing interplay of different parts of the brain all working together in this really intricate dance. And the book actually describes it as an essentially dynamic, complex physical element made up of energy and information flows from neuronal aggregates that are deployed simultaneously at several scales.
Okay, neuronal aggregates sounds pretty technical, right?
It does, but don't let the jargon scare you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm all for learning new words, but sometimes it feels like we're speaking a different language. But the way I understand it, these neuronal aggregates are basically like little groups of brain cells, neurons that work together as a team.
Exactly. They're like little processing units that specialize in different aspects of, everything.
And each individual thought we have, it's just like a a temporary configuration of these neuronal aggregates firing together in a particular pattern. The book calls these ephemeral configurations, which basically means they're fleeting, temporary, they pop up, do their thing, and then fade away.
Yeah, like bubbles, they appear, shimmer for a moment, and then pop. Our thoughts are kind of like that, always in flux, always changing.
Which honestly kind of explains why it can be so hard to hold on to a thought, right? It's like trying to hold water in your hands.
Exactly. And that's one of the key takeaways here. Our thoughts aren't these solid, permanent things. They're more like ripples in a pond. They come and go.
Which makes sense because if we held on to every single thought that popped into our heads, we'd probably go crazy.
Yeah, we'd be overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information.
So our brains are constantly filtering and processing and prioritizing all this stuff without us even realizing it. It's a pretty impressive system when you think about it.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it's way more complex than, say, a computer, which operates in a much more linear, step-by-step fashion.
Right. Our brains are like jazz musicians. They improvise, they riff, they create something new and unexpected in the moment.
It's a beautiful analogy.
It is. So this whole idea of thoughts being dynamic and constantly changing leads to this idea of a constructivist approach to thinking.
Now, that sounds a little bit intimidating, but it's actually not as complicated as it might seem.
Yeah, it's not like we're building a skyscraper or anything. It's more like building a sandcastle, maybe. We're constantly taking these raw materials, our experiences, our memories, our perceptions, and shaping and reshaping them into these like mental structures that we call thoughts.
And the source described thoughts as morphological representations. So morphological basically means relating to form or structure. So our thoughts are like these mental structures that we're actively constructing and then unfold over time.
So it's not like our thoughts just exist fully formed somewhere in our brains waiting to be discovered. It's more like we're constantly building and rebuilding them through this interplay of, what was it?
Energy and information.
Energy and information, right. It's like our brains are using energy and information as the building blocks of our thoughts.
And just like a builder uses bricks and mortar to create a house, our brains use energy and information to create the forms of our thoughts.
And these forms aren't just random, right? They actually refer to real things in the world.
Exactly. And they do that through how durable and consistent their forms are. So that means their characteristics, their aspects, their modes, and even their values. All these little details, all these nuances, they're what give our thoughts meaning and make them, well, about something.
So, for example, when I think about, I don't know, my cat, who, by the way, is the fluffiest, most adorable cat in the world, I'm not just pulling up some like generic cat image from a stock photo website, right?
Right. It's much more specific than that.
My brain is constructing a representation of my cat based on all its unique characteristics, all the little details that make it so special, like the way it purrs or the way it always sleeps in the exact same spot on the couch. All those specific details are what give my thought its form and make it about my cat, not just any cat.
And that's how our thoughts become meaningful and relevant to us.
Right.
They're anchored in our personal experiences and perceptions.
Exactly. Okay, so the book even talks about this idea of a minimal state of a thought. And from what I gathered, that's like the simplest kind of thought you can have. Like imagine just noticing the color red. That's a very basic thought, right?
Absolutely. It's like grasping a single isolated thing through our senses, a pure, unadulterated sensory input. That's the minimal state of a thought.
But then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the most complex state, which is like, whoa, hold on to your hats, folks, because this is where things get really wild.
Yeah, strap yourselves in.
Because the most complex state of a thought is like this pure abstract creation, like, I don't know, trying to wrap your head around string theory or debating the philosophical implications of artificial intelligence.
Or maybe trying to understand why people like pineapple on pizza.
Okay, that's a good one. So we've got this whole range of complexity from just red to like, what is the meaning of life, the universe, and everything? It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
And all of this complexity is built upon these basic building blocks that we've been talking about.
Right, the energy, the information, the neuronal aggregates, all that good stuff. Now, to get even more specific about how this whole system works, The source dives into these things called neuronal aggregates, and I think we touched on those earlier, but also these things called pre-aggregates.
Yeah, they're like the nuts and bolts of our mental machinery.
And I have to admit, when I first read about them, I was like, huh, what in the world are pre-aggregates? It sounds like something you'd find in a biology textbook.
They do sound a bit technical, but bear with me, because I think this is where things start to get really interesting. So remember how we talked about neuronal aggregates being like little groups of neurons that work
Yeah,
together?
like little brain cell teams.
Well, pre-aggregates are like specialized units within those teams. They're like the experts on the team, each one responsible for a specific task.
So, like, if you've got a neuronal aggregate that's all about processing visual information, you might have a pre-aggregate that specializes in recognizing colors, and another one that specializes in detecting edges, and so on.
Exactly. And these pre-aggregates play a crucial role in helping our brains make sense of the world. They help us identify and categorize objects, understand relationships between things, and even make predictions about what's going to happen next.
Okay, so they're like the pattern recognition specialists. They're the ones who help us see the forest for the trees.
That's a good way to put it. And they also help us make connections between different pieces of information. So, for example, if you see a furry, four-legged creature with a wagging tail, your pre-aggregates might work together to tell you, hey, that's a dog.
And they do all that super fast without us even realizing it. It's pretty amazing. Now, the source mentions that the information within a neuronal aggregate is an adaptively coherent flow. That sounds like a mouthful.
It does, but it's actually a really important concept. What it means is that the information isn't just like passively stored in these aggregates. It's constantly being processed and updated and adapted based on new experiences.
So it's like our brains are constantly learning and evolving, even at the level of these tiny neuronal aggregates.
Exactly. It's like imagine a river flowing downstream. The water's always moving, but it's also shaping and being shaped by the riverbed. That's kind of how our thoughts work. They're constantly flowing, but they're also constantly being shaped by our experiences.
And that flow is what makes our thinking so flexible and adaptable, right?
Yeah.
We can adjust to new situations, learn new things, and even change our minds based on new information.
Precisely. It's what allows us to be creative, to solve problems, and to navigate the complexities of the world around us.
So, this whole idea of thought being dynamic and constantly changing, it's not just some abstract concept. It's literally happening at the level of our brain cells. It's pretty incredible when you think about it.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it makes you appreciate just how powerful and adaptable our brains are.
Okay, so now that we've got a handle on the basic building blocks of thought, let's talk about memory. Because, we've all had those moments where we're like, wait, where did I put my keys? Or what was the name of that movie I just watched?
Yeah, memory can be a tricky thing.
It can be. But according to the source, memory isn't just about remembering specific facts or events. It's actually way more dynamic and organized than that.
More like an ever-changing library.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, it's less like pulling a book off a shelf and more like rearranging the entire library every time you take a book out.
Interesting. So it's not just about storing information, it's also about how we access and use that information.
Exactly. And the source emphasizes that memory, in this context, isn't like retrieving a file from a hard drive. It's a dynamic organization of aggregates that modifies itself when used. It's constantly changing and adapting based on our current needs and experiences.
So it's like every time we remember something, we're actually subtly reshaping that memory. We're strengthening some connections, weakening in others, and even adding new details based on our current understanding of the world.
Exactly. It's like every time you tell a story, it changes a little bit, right?
Oh, yeah, totally.
Right.
It's like that game of telephone we used to play as kids. By the time the message gets back to the first person, it's completely different. But back to memory.
Of course.
So when we remember something, we're not just pulling up the same exact file every time. We're reconstructing it, kind of like putting a puzzle together.
And the book talks about how this reconstruction process is based on a memory of confirmations and not a memory of components.
Now, what in the world does that mean? Conformations, components. Sounds like we're talking about building a spaceship or something.
It does sound pretty complicated, but let me try to break it down.
Okay, please do.
So think of it this way. When you remember an event, you're not necessarily remembering every single detail perfectly. It's more like you're remembering the overall shape or structure of the event, the way all the pieces fit together.
Ah, okay, so it's like remembering the gist of it, the main points, rather than every single word of the conversation or every single object in the room.
Exactly. You're remembering the overall pattern or configuration of the memory rather than the individual components.
So conformations are like the patterns and components are like the individual pieces.
Precisely.
Got it. Now, this whole organizational memory thing, how does it actually work? Like, what's happening in our brains when we try to remember something?
Well, the source outlines a fascinating process. It starts with what they call an aim input, which is basically our intention to remember something. Like when we say to ourselves, okay, what was I doing before I got distracted?
Right, like when you walk into a room and completely forget why you went there?
Exactly. So that aim input sends a request to all the relevant neuronal aggregates, kind of like a search query.
Like when you type something into Google.
Exactly. And those aggregates then start activating their pre-aggregates, those specialized units we talked about.
So it's like a chain reaction, right?
Yes, exactly.
One thing leads to another, and pretty soon a whole bunch of aggregates are firing together in this specific pattern. And that pattern is what we experience as remembering something.
And the more we activate those same patterns, the stronger those connections become,
Yeah.
which is why repetition helps us learn and remember things.
Makes sense. So practice makes perfect even for our brains.
Absolutely.
It all comes down to those connections, those neural pathways.
Yes, it's all about building and strengthening those connections.
Well, okay, so we've talked about the flow of thought, the building blocks, the dynamic nature of memory. But this whole system needs some kind of, I don't know, management team, right? It can't just be a free-for-all of brain activity.
Well, it's certainly not chaotic. There's definitely some organization going on.
Right. It'd be a mess. There has to be something that's keeping all these processes in check, making sure they're working together harmoniously. And that's where regulators come in.
Ah, yes, the regulators.
Yeah.
They're like the conductors of the brain's orchestra.
They keep everyone on beat.
Exactly. They ensure that all the different parts of the brain are working together in a coordinated and efficient way. The source describes them as rational controllers of the coactivity of neuronal aggregates.
Okay, so they're like the traffic cops of our thoughts. They direct the flow, make sure everything's moving smoothly, and prevent any like mental gridlock.
That's a great analogy. And they also represent our psychic tendencies and even our learned cultural behaviors.
Yeah.
So they're not just about managing the mechanics of thought, they're also shaping the content of our thoughts, what we pay attention to, and how we interpret the world around us.
So they're kind of like filters too.
In a way, yes. They help us focus our attention on what's important and filter out irrelevant information. And they also play a role in our emotional responses and our decision-making processes.
It's starting to sound like these regulators are pretty important.
They're absolutely essential. They're what allow us to function as thinking, feeling human beings.
And the book talks about different levels of regulators, right? Like preconscious and conscious.
Exactly.
So what's the difference between those?
Well, preconscious regulators are more automatic and instinctual. They handle things like basic bodily functions, immediate reactions to stimuli, and our innate drives and motivations.
So like fight or flight, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Got it. And then there are conscious regulators.
Yes. Those are the ones that are more deliberate and thoughtful. They involve things like planning, reasoning, decision-making, and moral judgments.
So the preconscious ones are like the autopilot, and the conscious ones are like the pilot.
That's a good way to think about it.
Cool. And I remember the book also talked about different ontological classes of regulators, and those were situational, structuring, and organizational, right?
You got it. It's a way of categorizing their function.
Okay, so walk me through those. What does each type do?
Sure. So situational regulators, they're the ones that define our immediate mental landscape, which we'll talk about next. Think of them as setting the stage for our thoughts, creating the context in which they arise.
So, like, if I'm feeling stressed and anxious, that's going to create a different mental landscape than if I'm feeling calm and relaxed.
Exactly.
And that landscape will then influence the kinds of thoughts that pop up.
Precisely. It sets the stage for what's possible, cognitively and emotionally. Then you have the structuring regulators, and those are the ones that control the fundamental building blocks of thought. They're kind of like the architects of our thoughts.
They design the blueprints.
Yes, exactly. They determine how those neuronal aggregates and pre-aggregates are organized and how they interact with each other. And then finally, you have the organizational regulators, and those are the ones that oversee the structuring regulators.
So it's like a hierarchy, kind of, like a chain of command.
In a way, yes. But it's important to remember that it's not a rigid system. All these different types of regulators are constantly interacting and influencing each other, creating this really dynamic and complex system of control.
Makes sense. It's our brains, after all. Nothing's ever simple with brains.
That's for sure. And, it's worth noting that these regulators can sometimes malfunction. They can be too weak, too strong, or they can have informational anomalies or even be absent altogether. And these dysfunctions can have a significant impact on the quality of our thinking.
So, like, someone with anxiety might have overactive regulators that are constantly sending out stress signals.
That's a good example.
Wow. It's incredible to think how much is going on under the hood, so to speak.
Absolutely.
Now, you keep mentioning this mental landscape. It sounds like a pretty important concept.
It really is. Think of it as the environment in which our thoughts arise.
Hmm.
It's the sum total of all the active elements in our psychic system at any given moment.
So, like, our mood, our focus, the information we're taking in, the memories we're accessing, all those things contribute to the mental landscape.
Exactly.
I got it.
And it's constantly changing and shifting, just like the landscape of the Earth.
And different landscapes will be more conducive to different kinds of thinking, right?
Absolutely. The book distinguishes between a natural, neutral mental landscape, which is what we experience when we're just passively taking in sensory information, and landscapes provoked by conscious focus, which are more active and directed.
So, like, if I'm just sitting here looking out the window, letting my mind wander, that's a natural, neutral landscape.
Exactly. It's like a blank canvas. And then when I start actively thinking about something like planning a trip or writing a poem, that's a landscape provoked by conscious focus.
Right.
You're bringing specific regulators and cognitive processes into play, and that shapes the landscape in a particular way.
And those landscapes, they influence the kinds of thoughts that are likely to arise.
Precisely. They provide the context, the framework, the possibilities for thinking.
So it's like our brains have different modes depending on what we're doing.
That's a great way to put it.
Cool. Okay, so we've got these mental landscapes, these ever-shifting environments where our thoughts take shape. But what's actually doing this shaping? What's putting all these pieces together? That's where generating forms come in, right?
That's right.
Now, those sound even more mysterious than regulators and pre-aggregates.
Well, think of them as the active agents in the neuronal network. They're the ones that actually drive the coactivation of neuronal aggregates and lead to the emergence of mental representations. They're like the sculptors of our thoughts.
Okay, I can picture that.
They take those raw materials, the information, the energy, the connections, and shape them into something meaningful.
And of course, there are different types of generating forms, right?
Yes, the book mentions two main types: generating forms for memory and generating forms for regulation.
Okay, so the memory ones are all about like solidifying our memories, making those connections stronger and more durable.
Precisely. They help us encode new information, strengthen existing memories, and make those memories more easily accessible.
And the regulation ones are about, well, regulation.
Exactly. They're the ones that ensure control at all levels of the system. They make sure that our thoughts are relevant to the task at hand, that we're staying focused, and that our thinking is aligned with our goals and values.
So they're kind of like the executive function.
Exactly. They're the ones that help us plan, organize, and execute our thoughts and actions.
Mhm.
And just like with regulators, there can be dysfunctions with generating forms as well. They can be too weak, too strong, or they can have informational anomalies. And these dysfunctions can lead to all sorts of problems with thinking and behavior.
So, like, someone with ADHD might have difficulty with generating forms for regulation, could explain why they have trouble staying focused and on task.
That's a plausible explanation, yes.
Wow, it's amazing to think that all these complex processes are happening in our brains all the time without us even being aware of them.
It is truly remarkable.
Now, one last thing I want to touch on before we wrap up is this idea of the feeling of thinking. Because, we all have that sense that we're the ones in control of our thoughts, that we're the ones doing the thinking. But how does that feeling actually arise? Like, what's happening in our brains that gives us that sense of agency?
That's a great question. And it's one that the source actually addresses directly.
Okay, good, because it's been bugging me.
So, according to the book, the feeling of thinking arises from the global evaluation of the conformations, remember those, created in the mental landscape by the generating forms of regulation.
Okay, whoa, back up a second. That's a lot to unpack. So, the feeling of thinking comes from evaluation.
Yes,
And this evaluation is happening at a global level, meaning it's not just one part of the brain that's doing it.
right. It's a whole brain process. And it's happening before any major changes occur in the mental landscape itself.
So it's like our brains are constantly monitoring and assessing their own activity.
Exactly. It's like a feedback loop.
Yeah.
And this feedback loop is what gives us that feeling of, hey, I'm thinking about this. It's the system becoming aware of its own activity, which then creates the feeling of agency, the feeling that we're the ones in control.
So it's not just that we're having thoughts, we're also aware that we're having thoughts, and that awareness is what gives us that feeling of, I don't know, being a thinking being. Wow. And that whole process is just happening automatically in the background without us having to consciously think about it.
Yes. It's one of those things that our brains just do effortlessly.
Our brains are pretty amazing.
We are, aren't they?
So, to recap, we've covered a lot of ground today. We talked about how thought is this dynamic, constantly changing process. We talked about the building blocks of thought, the neuronal aggregates, the pre-aggregates, the regulators, and the generating forms. We talked about how memory is organized and how we reconstruct memories. We talked about the mental landscape and how it shapes our thoughts. And we talked about the feeling of thinking and how it arises from the brain's self-monitoring process.
And we only scratch the surface.
Right. There's so much more to explore in this book.
But hopefully we've given our listeners a taste of just how complex and fascinating the human mind is.
And how much we still don't know.
Absolutely. There's still so much mystery and wonder to be uncovered.
And considering this incredibly complex and constantly active architecture of our minds, it really makes you think, doesn't it? How might this deeper understanding of our own minds continue to evolve? I mean, what implications could this have for how we approach education, how we support mental well-being, or even how we understand our relationship with the increasingly sophisticated artificial intelligences that are starting to appear?
Huge questions, and there are no easy answers.
Right. It's a lot to consider, but hopefully this deep dive has given you some food for thought, no pun intended. And if this has piqued your interest, I highly recommend checking out the source material for yourself. There's a whole world of fascinating stuff waiting to be explored.
Yeah, sure.
So until next time, happy thinking, everyone.
Keep those neuronal aggregates firing.